On the 28th of February, 2026, a missile struck a residential compound in northern Tehran. The precision strike eliminated a man who had controlled the fate of over 80 million people for nearly 4 decades. To understand how Iran arrived at this violent, high-tech reality, we have to rewind to the 1960s. Back then, Iran was ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a monarch heavily backed by Western powers, armed with advanced fighter jets and protected by a ruthless secret police. His opposition came from Ruhollah Khomeini, a stern, exiled cleric. Khomeini lacked an army. Instead, he weaponized a concept called Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, an idea that a senior cleric should hold supreme political authority. And his delivery mechanism was the standard cassette tape. Khomeini demanded that millions of citizens reject their earthly king and instead follow a literal, divinely appointed guardian. Working from exile in Paris, Khomeini recorded his sermons onto magnetic tape. These cassettes were smuggled into Iran, duplicated in basements, and passed hand to hand, entirely bypassing the Shah's security apparatus. The strategy worked. By early 1979, the Shah fled the country, and Khomeini returned to a cheering crowd of millions, establishing an Islamic Republic without firing a single shot. The new regime moved immediately to assert its severe doctrine. They took 66 American diplomats hostage in Tehran, and when Saddam Hussein invaded in 1980, Khomeini sustained a brutal 8-year war by sending waves of teenage boys across minefields, calling their deaths a religious blessing. But the system faced a massive test in June 1989, when Khomeini died of cancer. 8 million people flooded the streets for his funeral. The state was in mourning, and it was also in a severe succession crisis, because Khomeini had recently purged Ayatollah Montazeri, the man he originally chose to succeed him. The analog uprising had successfully built a state based on divine law, yet Khomeini's death exposed the core vulnerability of Vilayat-e-Faqih. A government demanding absolute obedience to God had no clear, divinely appointed heir to take the reins. The Assembly of Experts, the clerical body tasked with selecting the supreme leader, had to act fast. They chose Ali Khamenei, a mid-ranking cleric with a paralyzed right arm. He was a political survivor, but crucially, not a grand ayatollah. To make Khamenei eligible, allies amended the constitution within 24 hours, removing the requirement for top religious authority. Lacking charisma, Khamenei engineered loyalty through dependence. This sprawling chart illustrates his expanded patronage networks, relying heavily on the IRGC, Iran's elite military wing. Khamenei took this bureaucratic, military power and projected it outward. Tehran began heavily funding proxy militias like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, forming what the regime called the axis of resistance. By trading theological purity for hard military backing, Khamenei shifted the role of supreme leader. It ceased to be a position of divine reverence and became the apex of a shrewd, heavily armed bureaucracy. The illusion of domestic harmony shattered in 2009. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets of Tehran wearing green, protesting the highly contested presidential election victory of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Khamenei explicitly backed the rigged results and authorized a severe crackdown. Dozens of protesters were killed and hundreds imprisoned, erasing the public's hope that the system was capable of internal reform. That simmering anger boiled over again in September 2022. The death of Mahsa Amini, in police custody after an arrest over her hijab, ignited months of massive anti-regime protests, driven prominently by young women. Facing a highly unified civilian front across multiple cities, the regime panicked. It fell back on its primary survival mechanism, escalating its violence against its own people. The regime maintains its authority through the batons and bullets used against its own citizens. The tension culminated in early 2026. A slow-motion confrontation involving Iran, Israel, and the United States over nuclear infrastructure escalated into a direct high-tech missile strike on Tehran. Ali Khamenei was killed in the blast. For the first time in 36 years, the country was suddenly left with an empty throne at the very top of its power structure. The Assembly of Experts convened in an emergency session and selected Mojtaba Khamenei, Ali's 56-year-old son. Mojtaba lacks high religious status, But he brings a hardline background, having previously run the Basij, the state's voluntary paramilitary militia. 47 years after the revolution overthrew an inherited monarchy, the Islamic Republic installed its own dynasty. Mojtaba inherits a deeply fractured nation. He assumes command of a sanctioned, highly militarized state that is alienated from its highly educated population. He now faces the unresolved question that Ruhollah Khomeini introduced in 1979. Can a modern state be governed strictly by God's jurists, accountable to God alone, when the people on the ground explicitly reject that authority? A movement that started with the quiet, intimate whisper of a cassette tape has mutated into a cold, isolated military dynasty, currently waiting to see if it can survive the anger of its own citizens.